Hey you, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about something that's a little bit set standard and a little bit personal style choice. Let's talk about dialogue, grammar, and punctuation. Alright, so before we get started, we do need to look at some definitions to make sure everybody understands what I'm talking about as I talk through today's topic. So let's start with some basic punctuation definitions. Our first definition is double quotation marks. A lot of people kind of understand them to be these. A lot of people understand that double quotation marks are for when a character is speaking or when you are quoting something. And both of these are correct. And so that's just the basic definition of double quotations. They are for when a character is vocally speaking out loud, whether it's to themselves or to another character, doesn't matter. If it is out loud with their mouth, it gets double quotation marks. Our second definition is single quotation mark. Those are going to be for when a character is thinking internally, sometimes, we'll get to that later, or when you are putting emphasis on a word, depending on what kind of writing you're doing. If you're doing academic writing, in some cases, it is acceptable to use single quotation marks to emphasize a word within a sentence. Our next 4 punctuation marks are pretty easy to understand, so I'm just going to list them off. Periods, which go at the end of a sentence or statement. Commas, which can separate segments of a sentence. Exclamation points, which provide emphasis to a statement, and question marks, which are at the end of a question statement. So, moving on from punctuation, let's go ahead and look at 2 more quick definitions. You have internal and external. Now, these apply strictly to dialogue. You have internal dialogue, which is dialogue that happens strictly inside a character's head, and external dialogue. This is dialogue that happens with a character's mouth. It's the vocal dialogue. And again, that applies either whether they are talking out loud to themselves or out loud to another character or animal or what have you. Doesn't matter. If it's out loud using their mouths or using whatever way they communicate out loud, then it counts as external dialogue. All right, so last 2 definitions to talk about real quick, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. The first of these 2 is dialogue tags. We're going to get into dialogue tags in just a minute, but just to give you a quick rundown on dialogue tags, they are going to be those things that you put after quotation marks to denote who said what and how they said it. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Our last thing to define really quick before we get going is basic versus complex. In this video, I'm going to be talking about basic conversations and basic dialogue choices and dialogue tags and the like, and complex versions. And so I will give you examples of each as we go, but I want to make sure that you understand that you will get one of each for each thing that we talk about. All right, so let's get on into it. Our first thing to talk about is dialogue tags. So going with our basic to more complex, let's look at a basic dialogue tag. A basic dialogue tag is going to be something along the lines of John said, Sally said. So you will have your statement that one of these characters said, and at the end or at the beginning, you can put John said or Sally said. This is a very, very basic dialogue tag that lets your readers know who said what. The trick with these is to not get carried away and just keep repeating John said, Sally said, John said, Sally said. You can imagine that would get very tedious and very dull for the reader very fast. So, John said, Sally said. Those are our basic dialogue tags. Most people understand that concept. So let's look at a variation on the basic dialogue tags. A variation on simple dialogue tags can be something as easy as John whispered, Sally yelled. So rather than having John said or Sally said, you replace said with something that more clearly defines the way in which they said it. Now, most of the time you are going to want to go with said or a more complex dialogue tag, which we will talk about later, and you're not going to have your characters yell everything. And so these are needing to be reserved strictly for when an emphasis needs to be made on how your character said something. So now let's look at a more complex tag and something that lends a little bit more feeling to your dialogue and brings it to life a little bit more. In these tags, generally you combine a simple dialogue tag that explains how the character said something along with some action. Sometimes you can even take out that part of the basic dialogue tag that says how they said it if your action can play to how they said it and show, rather than tell, as we talked about in a different video, what the character is doing without coming out and saying it. Let's look at some examples. You could have something like, John whispered, picking up the knife. That is a dialogue tag that you can add on to the end of what John said, and it gives him that extended basic, a variation on the basic, showing that he whispered it and he didn't just say it out loud, along with an action that can be combined with that dialogue that he had that gives it a little bit more life. Another example of a complex dialogue tag could be, Sally yelled as she stepped from the curb towards the child standing in the street. This is one big long dialogue tag that gives an example of characters saying something a certain way and having an action to follow it up. Now, there's other punctuation that goes along with the character yelling, and I will talk about that here in a minute, along with punctuation that goes along with complex dialogue tags. So let's go ahead and look at some of that as well. So first, let's look at punctuation for external dialogue and what that looks like. As I said already, you're going to use double quotes for external dialogue. So an example would be, "Stop it," Sally said. Now you'll notice in this example, I didn't use a period. I used a comma. That's because the dialogue tag, Sally said, is part of that dialogue statement, and therefore the whole statement isn't finished until after that dialogue tag. So that's where the period goes, is at the end of that dialogue tag. Another example using some different punctuation could be, "Stop it," Sally yelled. Notice in this one, I didn't use a comma again. I used a exclamation point. That's because Sally yelled this, and we want to bring emphasis to the dialogue that she had with the exclamation point, and this pairs very nicely with the dialogue tag, "Yelled Sally." Our last example of basic dialogue punctuation and dialogue tags being combined is, "Stop it," Sally asked. Notice in this one I used a question mark because it becomes a question and Sally asked it, and the period still goes at the end to note that the statement has ended. So let's look at this example with a more complex dialogue tag. I'm only going to give two examples of this, one with a comma and one with an exclamation point, and you'll see the difference between the two statements. Our first example uses a regular comma and period. "Stop it," Sally said, taking the toy from the boy. Again, note that there is a comma used, and she said it because we're not putting any different emphasis on the fact that she said it any particular way. She simply said the statement and took the toy from the child. Our second complex example is, "Stop it," Sally yelled, taking the toy from the boy. This example gives a little bit more oomph to her dialogue and shows that she's a little bit more exasperated, frustrated, or upset because we use an exclamation point in place of the comma, and we added the more complex dialogue tag, "Sally yelled." This gives more feeling to her dialogue and more feeling to the scene in which we are exploring. All right, finally, let's look at complex statements, ones in which you have dialogue tags or dialogue both before and after on the statement, and it makes it richer and more complex, but let's go ahead and look at the punctuation of some of that. Much of the time, the way punctuation works in these kinds of statements depends on what's happening in the scene. So we're going to take a look at two different examples that give you two different ways that you can use punctuation in dialogue to create a certain feel for your dialogue. Our first example is a continuing statement in which you have dialogue, dialogue tag, and more dialogue as one continuing statement with no periods until the end. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. It's just, "He took a step towards her. I can't stop thinking about you." Notice that the action is in the center of the dialogue and that you use commas all the way through till the very end of the last bit of dialogue. That's because this action ties the two pieces of dialogue together. He takes the step and pauses in his dialogue through his statement. And the way we use punctuation in this shows that. It brings the dialogue to life, it brings the actions of the character to life, and makes the scene that much richer. Our second example has a dialogue tag, more dialogue, but you will find that there is an added period, and we will see how this affects the dialogue and the dialogue tag, along with the whole statement's feeling and how it functions. "Stop it," she said, taking the toy from the boy. "Haven't I told you not to fight with your brother?" Notice that this statement, instead of commas all throughout until we get to the end of the statement, has an additional period. This denotes that the dialogue tag goes with the first bit of dialogue, and that at the end of the dialogue tag marks the end of a first statement. But we have a second bit of dialogue that follows. Not all dialogue needs to be tied to a dialogue tag. This second bit of dialogue in our example shows that. It is kind of connected to a dialogue tag in some action, but it's not directly linked to a dialogue tag. It is technically its own standalone statement. But notice how it affects the action and the way that the dialogue and action flow in this particular scene. It's fitting and it reads as such. All right, so moving from external to internal, let's take a quick look at that. Basically, everything from external to internal applies. All of the stuff with the dialogue tags, all of the stuff with commas and periods, everything that I just finished talking about applies. The only thing that's different is those double quotes. Now, internal dialogue, I had to do a lot of research in because I had always heard that for internal dialogue, you use single quotes to note that this is internal versus external dialogue. But I found something very interesting that talked about how basically it's a style choice for the author, depending on how they feel whatever works in their manuscript. You can use single quotes, which is the more common method in the way that most editors still insist that you do, or you can use italics. You can italicize the words. So that's the style choice part of this video. Up until now, it was all pretty much grammar rules and grammar standards. This gives you a little bit of freedom with your characters. When your characters are having that internal monologue, you are able to decide whether you want to use single quotes or just put the words in italics. For an example of this is the same statement both ways. I can do it, she thought.
Alright, so I discovered after recording this video that my editing software has a bug in it that won't allow me to italicize text. So this bottom one, just imagine that the text is italicized up to that first comma, including the first comma. And just as a note, when you are italicizing this as an internal monologue, you would remove the quotation marks.
So let's take a real quick look at internal dialogue with all of those same rules applied in its complex form. Our first example uses exclamation points, bringing emphasis to the statement, even though it's internal dialogue. I can do this, she thought, stepping to the edge. I am strong. Notice the exclamation points and how they impact the dialogue as well as the action within the statement. Our second example uses only commas. Take note of how it changes the exact same dialogue and how it feels. I can do this, she thought, taking a step towards the edge. I am strong. Notice the lack of exclamation points in this second sentence changes the feel of the dialogue and the action. Neither one of these is right or wrong. It just depends on what's happening in your statement. Is your character all fired up and needs those exclamation points to really drive home their emotions and their feelings? Or, a couple of quick notes before we move on, just to keep in mind with dialogue, every time a new character starts speaking, you want to bump that down to a new paragraph, and every time the concepts that your character is talking about change, you want to bump that down to another line, and don't forget to indent your first line of dialogue every time. That's all I have for you today. I hope you learned something new and you can take this back and apply it to what you are working on to improve your dialogue between your characters or with your character's internal workings. I'd like to take this moment to ask you to subscribe below. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that little bell so that you get notifications next time I update. As always, I appreciate your time and every single one of you showing up. Thank you so much.